I'm going to do what's called a pro gamer move. Just do it!
Hey there guys, welcome back to another skill issue guide. This time we'll be looking at the J-10A Firebird, which weirdly arrived one too early for that titular update despite being the poster child for Dance of Dragons. This is a vehicle that requires a bit of a particular playstyle to consistently do well in because its primary weapon, the PL-12, has something a little weird going on with it. You see, in real life, the PL-12 is an extremely modern missile and equivalent to something like a later model AMRAAM, but in-game, as of the time of this recording, its drag coefficient is cranked up way too high, thus giving its range a massive artificial nerf. So even though this missile is larger than the AMRAAM, with greater thrust even in proportion to its larger size, it still winds up having substantially less range. And because you get about 90% of your kills with your Fox 3s at this BR, that ends up forcing you to play this aircraft in a way that compensates for this deficiency if you want to consistently do well in it. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying the PL-12 is bad by any means, especially when paired with this rather fantastic airframe, but it's not like the AMRAAM or the Mica where it just totally dominates in a particular niche. High-altitude BVR jousting will just get you murdered by AMRAAMs. Flying at medium altitude is kinda inconsistent, and at low altitude, this missile is just too large and heavy to work well as an effective dogfight weapon. There is one area in which this thing gets a bit of an edge in over the AMRAAM though, which is that it has a bit better initial acceleration, so within close to mid-range when the burner is still going, this will actually reach the target faster than an AMRAAM would, despite having worse range overall, weirdly enough. It's also a little bit more maneuverable than the AMRAAM, with 40 Gs of maximum overload instead of the AMRAAM's 35. I know the stat card says 38, but this isn't actually correct. Here's the part where I have to add a big fat caveat, which is that I heavily suspect that Gaijin is keeping this thing nerfed intentionally for game balance purposes, and may eventually get rid of the artificial range nerf once the BR cap is raised and more advanced AMRAAM variants are added. For its IR missiles, we get the PL-5E2, which is close to identical to your normal PL-5 in terms of flight performance, but with an extra 5 Gs of pole and the addition of IRCCM. Now, to be clear, this is FOV IRCCM like on the R-73 rather than seeker shutoff like on the AIM-9M, which makes it better suited for close-range shots rather than long-range engagements, and if someone is pre-flaring and they're more than like 2 kilometers away, that's probably going to trick the missile. It feels very similar to the Magic 2 if you've used that missile before. It actually has a little bit more range, but slightly less maneuverability since even though it has the same G-load, its fin AOA is a good bit lower. And by the way, I'll link Kopany 99's guided weapon datasheet in the description if you want to look over all these numbers on your own. For the gun, it gets the Gush 23, same as on the MiG-21 and 23, which is kinda crap for this BR, but it's not like you'll almost ever get any gun kills with this thing anyways, so it's whatever. In terms of airframe, it's absolutely fantastic. It's extremely maneuverable, very fast, good acceleration for a single engine, and just generally feels extremely responsive and snappy at basically all speeds. I didn't get any actual dogfight footage while recording for this, because at this BR, someone will pretty much always come in at third-party one of you, but the TLDR is that in a 1v1 on even terms, it will beat basically everything. Flankers, F-16s, F-15s, etc. The only thing that might give you some real trouble is the Mirage 2000, but those aren't super common, so the chances of actually finding yourself in a dogfight against one are not particularly high. One last thing I'll mention before I get on to strategy is that when I was getting footage for this video, the radar seemed to perform absolutely terribly. It seemed to have a very hard time picking up targets and maintaining lock. I'm not exactly sure what the reason for this is, but be aware that's something you may encounter unless Gaijin goes in and fiddles with the radar programming again for like the 8th time this month. Anyways, so how do you play this thing? Well, it took me a while to find a strategy that worked consistently, but here is what I found worked best. What you're going to want to do is, right after takeoff, take a hard left, pitch your nose up 25 degrees, and from there climb to around 9,000 meters or 30,000 feet. What I'm doing here is not setting up for high altitude BVR. Instead, I'm going to jink back in towards the combat area and then try to attack the low-flying enemies once they circle back around your team's bases. You can pretty reliably tell where the enemies will be just by checking to see how far your team has made it on the map, by the way. This lets you avoid the initial BVR joust, which is good for you since not only would enemy AMRAMs defeat you, obviously, but also your own team's AMRAMs will probably reach any good targets first, so generally you just end up wasting your missiles by even participating. If you need to go defensive during this whole process, don't worry, it doesn't really matter if you lose time or altitude since your intercept window is pretty wide. From this distance, you can defeat most launches kinematically by just changing direction, so just do what you need to do to stay alive. From here, you can just start unloading your PL-12s on anyone you see. The altitude will help make up for that really bad drag they have just by giving them a lot more potential energy to work with, and the responsiveness of this aircraft will let you quickly disengage and turn away if somebody returns fire. I would personally advise against using TWS to find your targets because of how finicky this radar is at the moment. Instead, I would just hard lock them once they get into HMD range, since that's going to be about the effective range of the missiles anyways. I find I get an average of 2 or 3 kills in the first volley, assuming you fire off all your missiles at actually good targets. If someone is flying parallel or away from you, don't even bother, these missiles just don't have the range to chase them down. By this point, either your entire team will have been wiped out, or the enemy will have been whittled down to only a few players left, at which point you can then use your excellent airframe and IR missiles to go hunt them down. Just one last note I wanted to throw in, because I forgot to get to it earlier in the video. This thing also gets PL-8s, which are superior to the PL-5s in terms of flight performance, but they lack IRCCM, so I wouldn't recommend using them. It's been strongly hinted at that this thing will get later model PL-8 variants, like in future updates with IRCCM, and once those are added, I would recommend taking those over the PL-5s. But that's pretty much all there is to the J-10A. It's a pretty fun vehicle to fly as long as you can avoid that initial AMRAM volley, and there's a certain level of peace of mind in knowing that you're pretty much always going to come out on top in the case of a merge. Anyways guys, if you enjoyed this content, please like, comment, and subscribe. Check out more similar content linked in the end screen, and I'll see you guys in the next one.